On Truthtelling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 49. Report on Professor Shamus's course. 1994. First class, September 19, 1994. A small but crowded classroom. Professor Shamus comes in and sits down. He is casually dressed but with a rather imposing look. He starts to explain why the primary text, Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, isn't available in the bookstore. I have difficulty following his explanation. He then tells us that, given the heavy workload, he would prefer to have only those students willing to roll up their sleeves. Anyone who is not prepared to do so should think about clearing out. He gives us a couple of handouts. One of them is an unidentified excerpt from a philosophy text. The other is an untitled poem beginning with the line, "Think flesh." He gives us 10 minutes to read and think about these texts. A discussion follows after the 10-minute break. He focuses on one student who is obviously trying hard to understand the unidentified Merleau-Ponty text. Professor Shamus seems particularly concerned with the student's choice of words. They seem inept to him and he badgers her about this. The student doggedly goes from one explanation to another. An amazing amount of time is taken up by this. Despite the difficulty of the Merleau-Ponty text, Professor Shamus at no time makes any attempt to identify it. He seems to think that we should be able to grasp it without any preliminaries. Then he gives us a reading assignment for the next class. It is an excerpt from the 4th chapter of Merleau-Ponty's posthumous work, The Visible and the Invisible. This text is even more difficult than the first. After class I go to Professor Shamus's office. I tell him that I am perplexed by the way he is proceeding. Instead of showing any surprise or concern, he tells me, give it time. There's no closure. Second class, September 26, 1994. Professor Shamus asks us if we have any questions about the visible and the invisible text. No one is able to do more than raise a few feeble questions. Showing impatience, he then asks, how can we have a class if no one comes to it prepared to ask questions? At this point I ask him why he decided to give us a difficult text without the benefit of any introduction or commentary. He quickly answers, because it's good. He then begins a discussion about the large oak table that is in our room. A number of times he speaks about the importance of respecting this table. One respects it because of the quality of workmanship that went into it, because of its durability, and because of its long service in the classroom. At some point he asks people to get up and lift the table. All of this of course induces as much mirth as mystification. The affair with the table lasts about 40 minutes. He then gives us a writing assignment. We are all to tell him what we have learned thus far. By now I'm getting the feeling I'm caught in some scene from Alice in Wonderland. This feeling becomes even more pronounced when I look around me and see all the serious faces. I speak once again to Professor Shamus after class. When I mention the difficulties I'm encountering and my inability to fathom what he is up to, he only keeps repeating, because it's good. When I ask him why he isn't lecturing on Merleau-Ponty, he replies that he can only do so if students come to class prepared to ask questions. Third class, October 3, 1994. Professor Shamus asks me to read what I have written in response to his assignment of the previous week. It is essentially the suggestion that each and every student come to class prepared to ask questions. A brief discussion then follows. At some point he decides to have everyone read his or her assignment. Since I have been thinking for some time now I'm the only one having doubts about the class, I'm surprised when a student criticizes the Think Flesh poem, written, as I find out later, by Professor Shamus. 2 other students complain about this or that. Then one student reads his assignment at breakneck speed. It is full of quotations from, as I find out later, Merleau-Ponty's The Visible and the Invisible. What this student reads is utterly incomprehensible. Professor Shamus praises it warmly. Then he places before us a monstrous candle. While lighting it, he goes into a long story about his father who sold candles. It is never clear to me why the candle is being presented. He then gives us another reading assignment. It is the section of the Phenomenology of Perception called The Body as Expression and Speech. Fourth class, October 17, 1994. The large beeswax candle makes a second appearance. At some point it is lit and passed around. People are invited to smell the candle. Then a cassette player is turned on and the whole class, with lights turned off and the lit candle being passed around, listens to some pop song sung by the Irish singer, Shamus. Professor Shamus gives no indication that the name of this singer has anything to do with his choice of music or the proceedings in general. Then there are some more readings from the previous assignment. People discuss how the course is progressing and what they are learning. Neither one of the Merleau-Ponty texts is mentioned or brought up for discussion. I once again go to Professor Shamus's office. I tell him that I think his teaching is a sham. Without so much as batting an eye, he takes the pipe out of his mouth only long enough to ask me what is to be done. I tell him that I no longer wish to attend his classes but simply complete the course with a written assignment. He quickly nods and gives his consent. Summary statement, December 30, 1994. I do not believe that Professor Shamus taught this course in a way that even remotely resembles the description of it in the philosophy course guide. I therefore believe that, for this reason and others, I was justified in arranging not to attend his classes. Alice, would you get me a glass of water, please? It was like something out of Alice in Wonderland. Can you vouch for the authenticity of this report? Beyond a few literary flourishes, he put down exactly what happened. Oh, Ireland, you beckon to me now more than ever. If there is any one factor that militates against truth-telling, it must be doing harm to others. At the same time, no other factor, apart from doing good, is so implicated in it. It is an immense issue too tangled and slippery and even dangerous to be faced or sorted out. Choron, in his Précis de Decomposition, blames every sort of doctrine for fanaticism and bloodshed. I agree with this insofar as there is much in history to justify it. But holding this view could also be considered a doctrine. At the same time, I do not find myself metaphysically or epistemologically scandalized by it. For the whole that is characterized as meaningless by Choron is for me both infinite and infinitesimal, the infinite in the infinitesimal. Partaking of both, we have equal reason to be full of conceit and wide hopes as we do contempt and despair. When it comes to practical affairs, our fishbowl world is enough of an ocean for anyone to swim in. The morality of our social being virtually pushes every other consideration aside when it comes to wanting to be recognized as a social being. Something of the sort is operating in me now when I choose not to report all facts as I know them but change one so as to prevent possible harm. Of course I like to think that I'm doing this out of a sense of fair play. On truth-telling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 50. Letter to Professor Shamus, 1995. Dear Professor Shamus, I want to thank you for your kind words about my essay. Given my criticism of your course, I find them all the more remarkable. As is usually the case in such instances, I feel a bit guilty. You see, I was fully prepared to suffer what I have already suffered at the hands of a couple of other professors who, as you probably know, I ran afoul of. In my opinion, they have used indirect as well as direct means to show their disapproval. I challenged their authority and no doubt they believed so much in it and so little in mine that they felt justified in doing so. Furthermore, I think that, with respect to the assignment you marked and made some appreciative comments on, I put myself in a vulnerable position. All the more then am I appreciative of your not exhibiting any resentment. Writing the essay as I did, that is, as a series of aphorisms, was certainly not the safest way to go about it. In short, it was less the business of exhibiting my knowledge of the subject than exploring my reaction to the author's thought. The latter is of course a much more personal approach than is normally encouraged. So a new perspective has been added. A bit of sorrow too in contemplating how it might have been under different circumstances. What am I to make of the fact that, a couple of years later, a blind referee made some smarmy comments about this essay and, unkindest cut of all, claimed that it had no literary merit? Should I think that he was upset by my attempt to get it published in a scholarly journal, even one that was relatively modest and put out by graduate students? That he couldn't simply criticize it on a philosophical level? That he felt compelled to attack it where he thought the heart of its presumption lay? Is my war against professors or, more properly, the all-too-professional a bit of paranoia? Should I be on guard against the Rousseauian type of persecution complex? I have no proper answer to these questions apart from turning the matter over and exposing every doubt that registers in my psyche as subjective truth and every certitude that registers there, whether it be a certitude for anyone else or not, as an objective one. Surely a sign of literary merit is to keep on track. To bring unity to diversity and vice versa. Did the blind referee who evaluated my essay say anything that specifically demonstrated a lack of this? Like many professors, he no doubt was in a hurry, and so, resting on the authority that was vested in him, he scanned this and other matters. I suppose that nothing more than a heightened sense of moral obligation would have led him to do otherwise. A heightened sense of moral obligation. Something like I obviously believe I have. But directed towards telling the truth and not necessarily going much further. In one way the Merleau-Ponty essay was this attempt. Perhaps its alleged lack of literary merit was simply its being too obviously and obtrusively so. Perhaps art tells the truth of the whole simply by telling the truth of the part. In which case trying to tell the truth of the whole artfully and as the whole, that is, mainly as a philosophical attempt, would smack of the immodesty and presumption that art manages to avoid. In philosophy everybody is seeking their answer to this or that, and nobody wants to be closed off or closed in by the conflicting answer of another. Let's not get sidetracked. I want to hear more about his exploits at Concordia. On Truthtelling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 51. The one sweet all-embracing encounter. I wasn't exploitative. That's the most that can be said. I longed for the one sweet all-embracing encounter. In the meantime I was, though in my 45th year, horny as all hell. For every good-looking young thing that came into my range of vision. But impotent as all hell to remedy the situation. I was horny but hard-headed. That's the way with me. I was horny but holding back. Wanting, what? Great hospitality. To be the hero that always seemed right to me. To win my love with honor, grace, and style. That too seemed, oh, but please don't say. Impossibility. I am this impossibility made possible for you. Oh, let me run my fingers into your brain. Let me curve my body into yours. Let me make you think you have no life apart from me. I have been waiting a good long time for this. I will burn you as if I were a goddess. I will be so seductive and searching in finding out all the secret parts of your pleasure that you won't be able to get enough of what will ultimately kill you. What strange words. Alice, are you all right? I will exalt you to the heavens and at the same time tantalize you, conquer you, destroy you. Are you in a trance? Are you auditioning for a part? Heavens, are you reading his mind and now reading it back to him? I won't let you go. As helpless as a baby, as a little child you may struggle against me. But you know deep down that nothing is more delicious than to have me in control. Oh, what will it avail you then, Mr. Philosopher, to think yourself independent, free-spirited, and heroic? Once I start to bite, scratch, squeeze, tease, and tear you, your intellectual lights will go out and all you'll think of is how much I give by making you raw, naked, defenseless, subject to my every whim and caprice. You're willing to waste your time trying to warm up his old bones. As far as I can judge, it's because you're only an erotic fantasy. The true coeds he lusted after, it seems pretty clear to me, weren't interested in him. On Truthtelling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 52. My Montreal Experience. 1995. How shall I recount thee? How shall I say the thing that matters? How shall I be fair to thee? O fairest of cities, and yet relieve my heart. Speaking of life's rough handling. Which of course you didn't begin. And certainly did not end. But I only thought you might. I remain faithful to some painful and ambiguous sense of honor. I hardly know whether this hair shirt suits me. It seems to contradict so badly wanting to be one of fortune's favorites. Yet. There was a time I thought I might win her love by taking this stonier path. I dreamt that she might surprise me on the way. And offer herself, amorously, passionately, admiringly. And now, it seems, I have but this path underfoot, sorry fool that I've made of myself. And no fair greeting, no fairest of greetings. To exalt me. I have traveled this path so long that I take it less and less to be a worthy companion. Yet I know no other. After you've stopped crying, I'll get down on my old knees and, like Lear, ask pardon of you. I'm just a might-have-been actor turned professor who's never played a heroic part in his life. You have seen sunshine and rain at once, her smiles and tears were like a better way, those happy smiles that played on her ripe lip, seemed not to know what guests were in her eyes, which parted thence as pearls from diamonds dropped. In brief, sorrow would be a rarity most beloved, if all could so become it. Perhaps it is time to get back on track. I have tried to bring in a more thorough testimony of my bias as a truth-teller. Also, I might add, and with the idea of not letting a mote of it out of my sight, of my grandeur as one. After all, a certain self-inflation goes along with what I'm doing and even becomes it as much as the opposite tendency. But the mote I'm trying to see is also in my eye where it can't help but be a blind spot and, even as such, focus of my attention. It is really what remains out of focus, out of sight, such that, with all the care and attention I devote to it, it is where I end up thinking a good deal of myself for thinking less of myself. For thinking what is common enough, as both generally admired trait and secret form of self-aggrandizement, even when thinking what is not so common. On truth-telling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 53. Some Mad Thoughts About Philosophy. 1995. Generally speaking, one wants to think well of philosophy. However, due to the lack or seeming lack of definitive results, unhappiness and dissatisfaction with it are quite often the order of the day. A good part of our philosophical selves, it seems, would like to find some final resting place for and from deepest problems. Some intellectually hallowed ground for the purpose of burying them once and for all, and then presumably erecting in their place eternal monuments. Less sardonically speaking, perhaps it is that we wish to see imperishable fruit grow from the tree of philosophy since it tends to promise or proclaim as much. Perhaps the desire to see such fruit explains the existence of and propensity to the modern sciences. That they abandon deepest problems and seek to pose and solve only ones of their own making, that they ignore all unanswerable questions in favor of ones for which answers are already waiting, is no doubt the necessary compromising and redirected satisfaction of the original impulse which, after centuries of long hard, empty-handed struggle, is now very much self-involved, a questioning of its very being or right to be. Yet philosophy's questioning of itself, its rigorous soul-searching and self-examination, its often tiresome polemics regarding its own proper role, especially in relation to the other disciplines, is, and here is no doubt both something of the ironic and something of the most straightforward and fitting, the philosophical spirit itself speaking. It is the spirit which forever wants to understand deeply and comprehensively, which will not be satisfied with whatever simply asserts itself appealingly, with that which, in promising certain advantages and fruitful prospects, can buy off to a certain extent the almost pathologically, that is, almost religiously, impassioned and inquiring mind. In short, it is the spirit that won't allow philosophy to rest, to make peace with the most vexing, intractable, and seemingly hopeless of problems. Of course, the above characterization of philosophy is one which infers numerous inquiring minds interacting with their times as well as their positive and negative reactions to the legacy of earlier ones. Taken in this light, it must be one with these minds while in some sense going beyond them, being forever the movement of radical inquiry, of an unceasing reappearance of what indubitably turns out to be the supremely subversive question and the highly provocative answer. Individually speaking, it often yearns for and places itself at the level of the sure-footed sciences, the disciplines which conveniently adjust their bases for the sake of their development and preservation. While philosophy confounds the one when it confounds the other, it is also the model of the above comportment insofar as it views itself not as a completely finished but a finishable affair. Insofar as it is not an enterprise which lacks practitioners and active defenders of its presuppositions and principles but, quite the contrary, holds it far-flung fields and vast domains successfully and finds, in so doing, the necessary expedients. But philosophy on the whole and as a movement is quite as much the other thing, that is, the scorn and scourge of the territorially minded, of the singular expansion and hegemonic drive, of those who put up boundaries. It only endures as, and ultimately recognizes itself in, the wholly free, wholly open, and, if need be, wholly destructive adventure. Disciplined and yet untamed, it finds its glory not so much in the arriving but the striving, in the skirting around and peering into, ultimately in defying, the abysses of doubt, uncertainty, and despair which threaten precipitately. What is sedate in it and finds equilibrium is forever confounded. It is, in some respects, a mad adventure. The proposal I wish to make is that philosophy must push beyond its present malaise by taking it wholly and willingly upon itself. It must find the bearing up under it and overcoming of it virtually indistinguishable. To escape from such a burden must be so total an undertaking, so unsparing in effort and commitment, so singular in focus, that it places upon philosophy a burden which ultimately cannot be escaped. When in setting down its burden on occasion, it raises its eyes to the lofty ascent before it with its sheer precipices and craggy heights, when it anguishes deeply over its forbidding allure, its most remote, inaccessible regions, and when it ponders chillingly how many before, great-souled ones, tried in vain, mistaking one or other of its cloud-capped peaks for the highest of summits, the heaven of a hard-earned, all-seeing human brilliance, there are moments philosophy may falter or grow faint of heart, but also moments to spur it on to new attempts and to the only true and proper measure of itself. Without the feeling of inspiration, of ever-renewed inspiration, a group, a society, a way of life, an individual, an institution, a course of study and learning grows moribund and otiose. Few things appear so inevitable. We may well have reached a point of having too much history, and so singularly sad and oppressive. Confronted with what we know about the mortality of things in general, that is, things formerly taken to be eternal, God, soul, heaven, truth, knowledge, goodness, etc., and in this way redemptive of specifically human mortality, it is not easy to escape the conclusion that, rather than knowing not enough about such things, we already know too much. What we seem to know only too well is that even the most highly exalted values, ideals, and traditions have their certain lifespan, their declining course as much as their rising one. Although this may not be the last word on the subject, and, if silence does not follow, it certainly cannot be, it is the only word which we, in our present situation, can utter honestly and directly. Yet we live, and in living humanly, must forever be the living contradiction of this dismal and dreary train of thought. We must perforce be its opposite. In philosophy itself, the consciousness of this living contradiction, the deepening of this consciousness, is the particular life of radical inquiry as it now presents itself, signaling perhaps its mortality but also its striving and thriving to the uttermost, beyond the always threatening temptation to play itself out meekly, without lucidity, without a struggle, without a resurgence of desperate vitality, without a bang but a whimper. My proposal is that we should entertain the notion of the eventual insupportability of philosophy, or, as Horatio tells Hamlet in the graveyard scene, the matter of considering things too curiously. Yet, as with Hamlet, such a consideration asks of philosophy further consideration and, insofar as, by following this course, it remains true to itself to the end, that is to say, to the point when powerful strange events should overtake, in unpredictable ways, all such considerations, it remains great and good for us. We need not despise it, in other words, for equivocating or selling out to the largely unphilosophical world. Of course, in making this proposal, a certain way of valuing and judging presents itself. We present the way we think philosophy must go and the way in which it should conduct itself upon the basis of what we see as our own sure direction and what is and will always be, as we should like to think, our conduct. Our speaking at all upon the matter is a vesting of ourselves with a certain kind of authority which can never adequately explain itself, which relies merely upon the fact of having something to say at all upon this matter. If some come along speaking or arguing to the contrary and much better than we can manage, then, while we ourselves may bare our teeth to them and continue in our folly, others certainly will not. We really speak then of a certain strain of thinking prompted by, and itself prompting, a growing presentiment, a certain anxiety of the age, itself aging. More than ever, we have difficulty acknowledging anything human or humanly related as that which can still shine upon the soul like an eternal sun and make, by contrast, every crossing shadow and dark place within it insignificant. In point of fact, we see how much our knowledge and understanding, like great heliotropes, have ever searched out this sun and, as much as they have grown high and free-standing but have failed to pierce the shifting racks of somber, high-flying clouds, so we begin to agonize over the gray bars imprisoning our puny striving and allowing us but longing looks at the dance which, with all our hearts, we still should like to, join. The dance of our pretty bright-faced hopes on the evening green, exuberantly oblivious to heaven's closing eye. Our poetic way of viewing philosophy, of doing philosophy, is the only answer to the mounting oppression which now bears upon us and yet which we may not abandon without abandoning our philosophical selves. What others call philosophy looks more to us like distraction, or business, or livelihood, or reputation. In other words, passing affairs which neither chasten with ice-cold counsel nor move us with a movement at one time considered sacred, marvelous, the witnessing of the divine presence itself. It is the poetic which can deal best with the paradoxical, is the paradoxical, the philosophical enterprise, the voice of reason itself. At least such is the case when the latter grows in the imagination to titanic proportions and, as well as seeming to resound throughout all being, ennobles mankind in its own eyes and impels it towards seeing itself, settling itself down on an equal footing with the formerly frightening and mysterious. Science no doubt strongly, and weakly, continues this tradition. Strongly insofar as it maintains an aspect, an aura, an illusion of ever enlarging itself to a complete comprehension. Weakly insofar as it proliferates in the form of a loosely related collection of more or less separate advances and random avenues of development. It is the sense then of a mere semblance of order, of cohesion, of a rational whole developing which sends us back to the source of systematic thinking, to what unquestionably strives to be a total viewing, a total comprehension. Yet now we are in the position of admiring this adventurous spirit, this often unaccountable and often unacceptable abundance of confidence and scornful wickedness, less for any single achievement than for daring to sail, always to sail upon open seas. Here is youth and vitality, in other words, married to long hard years of experience, risking sturm und drang to break the bonds, and often the back, of the already established, the already known and respected, the already won and secured. What proof is ultimately more tested, more resistant to being called into question and doubted, than that rational being has plied this course, this really very bold and reckless course, to its credit and, even if now faced with its most perilous voyage, finds its great strength and maturity in both becoming aware of its severe limitations and, despite this, marshalling itself for the great encounter beyond them. Let us present a thought rarely attended to. All the fair and perfect things of this world are the product of some singular, limited viewing, some captured perspective which initiates the struggle to prolong it. At the highest reach this struggle is artful, philosophic, and religious. It means to work some given radiance into a durable, often thought to be eternal form. Such captured perspectives, such radiances are no doubt inexhaustible. They figure in the constant flux of our daily lives which itself is not anything particularly artful, philosophic, or religious. Here is rather the mere play of a proceedings which largely mystifies us and whose power and hold upon us are mostly to our chagrin. It is in opposition to this mixture of circus and miasma that work, in effect, becomes a holy relief, an anchor, a sail, a fair breeze, a clear direction. Here, in opposition to everywhere else, our cunning and captaincy count, our story takes on a special hue, and the interest and excitement of a particular life's course transcend banality and the various minutiae tangling up our thoughts, so sorely troubling and even tormenting. To be clear of the latter, to rise up finally above it all, this is the motif, the constant, underlying theme of all exceptional, enduring efforts. We have no choice but to think philosophy inspirationally and therefore, under present conditions, tragically. Hence the quality of its movement is the preeminent thing, the non-avoidance of all circumstances and conditions which challenge it radically. Without the latter of course it could not be itself, it would be religion or else some flaccid or fanatically inclined ideology, and yet this very being of itself is, despite understandable slips to the contrary, the willing, the even willful exposure of itself to severe blows, insults, injuries, and internal ruptures. To disallow these last to make a poor thing of it, we decry the current attempt to downsize it. Before the final shake-up, the force which cannot be stayed, is its heroic resolve, its true tenor and accomplishment. What matter all its various propositions and principles in comparison with its living liberally, passionately, and intensely? What matter some final arrival or indolent resting place, some paradoxically regained Garden of Eden in comparison with its having its own story, with its being interesting in its own way? So the proposal that I am making is that the emphasis must now fall upon the vision of philosophy as an increasingly stricken but noble venture, the tragic beauty, as opposed to its ever finding some eternal treasure, truth, or founding some eternally happy race of people, goodness. I speak with regard to its present situation and a certain tendency to preserve itself at all costs. I speak in light of what appears to me to be the studious avoidance of this hardest question concerning itself. Indeed, it appears to me as if the question has been hardly raised. Raising it, it risks itself. Not raising it, it is not itself. Or rather it ceases to be itself but in name only. It grows inwardly cold to what it formerly was and retains only an outward show of lukewarm piety. It dies spiritually before it dies physically. It works by degrees towards such a humble petering out of itself rather than towards its most self-revealing encounter. If the latter is more of a madness than the former, it is nonetheless the madness of reason itself, putting on its best show.